there has been a lot of news since we've last been on.
Yeah, no question.
Let's jump into the Roto-World headlines here. Of course, for all your Roto-World news, go to NBCSports.com. And in the spirit of being in New Orleans, our first bit of news, NFL Network's Tom Pelissero reports that the Saints plan to meet with the Eagles offensive coordinator Kellen Moore for their head coaching vacancy after the Super Bowl. Almost feels like, guys, and this is the last spot open right now, that they're just waiting for the Super Bowl, and then he will be the next head coach of the Saints.
Yeah, I mean, listen, when you're in the Saints, it's the only job open, so you might as well take your time. There's no reason to rush at this point. You're not competing with anyone else. Kellen Moore, it's an interesting one. Very successful with Dallas. Kind of didn't have a great year with the Chargers. Now seems to be somewhat resurrected with Philadelphia, and how much of that is the credit to his play calling versus, like, they have an unbelievable offensive line. They have one of, if not the best running back in football. They have, they've got elite playmakers at almost every position. So I don't know. Like,
is there anything, Connor, to suggest that Kellen Moore is like an outlier, good offensive mind? Like, it seems like the Eagles run 3 different run plays, and the passing game's going backwards.
Right. It's listen, I think the Saints, number one, didn't have a lot of hiring power here when you just go through the cap situation. Sure. This is going to take a while to clean up and clean out, and they went into this process hoping to get Aaron Glenn. That didn't happen. I think there was some other names, maybe Mike McCarthy at once upon a time, and they're going to have to go. You mentioned it. We have different tiers of guests. There's different tiers of head coaching candidates.
Yeah, I mean, I think they expressed interest in Cliff Kingsbury. Cliff did not want to go there. He's come back to the Commanders. Hail to the Commanders. Hail victory. Look, I think Kellen Moore is probably a pretty good offensive coordinator. Maybe that makes him a good head coach. Maybe that doesn't. I don't know. It doesn't feel like and so much of this, and it's a weird one, right? Because this isn't fair to Kellen Moore. But I feel like so much of coaching hires is about hype. Like, just hype that gets up in the press and everything like that.
And Ben Johnson.
Exactly. And just, I remember, this goes way, way back, but I remember when I was a little kid, and the Washington pro football team had a coaching opening. And I really wanted, why am I blanking on the name? He was not Bud Adams. It was who's Buddy Ryan's dad?
Buddy Ryan's dad.
Yeah.
Was it Insult the Comic Dog?
No. It was
Nolan Ryan?
No, I'm completely blanking on it. He was the head coach of the Houston Oilers.
I can't help you.
Are you thinking of Wade Phillips' dad?
I'm Bum Phillips. That's who it was. Thank you. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
We got there.
Thank you. Sorry, it's been a long travel day to get to New Orleans.
It wasn't. It was a relatively short flight.
I couldn't see the menu. I couldn't see the menu last night, and Jay was drinking dessert wine with his pinky. A lot's going on.
So
Bum Phillips. Bum Phillips was the coach of the Houston Oilers, and Love Ya Blue, and he was a very colorful character.
Oh yeah,
really
big
fun.
jackets and
big
hats.
jackets and the hats, and the media loved Bum Phillips. Always good for a quote. And I was a young fan in Washington, and Bum Phillips was talked about as one of the guys that was potentially open for. And I was so disappointed when they decided not to hire Bum Phillips, who was the guy that had all the hype, and instead they hired some, relatively unknown offensive coordinator from the Chargers named Joe Gibbs. Obviously, the rest is history. Like, right. I just, you know what I mean? And so I just sort of think about, like, we see some of these insiders and they pump these guys up and, there's all this heat and everything like that. And you're just like, does that necessarily make sense?
Bud Adams.
But I knew it was, Bud Adams coaching anyway, I know how my mind got there, but yes, Bum Phillips.
These percentages aren't perfect, but I think for the most part, and this is across multiple different sports, is that 80% of the coaches, there's this kind of sameness. 10% are quite bad, and then there are 10% who are real game changers, revolutionaries, and it just feels like Kellen Moore is taking a shot at the 80% sameness. Like, I don't think that there is a high chance that Kellen Moore is going to be a revolutionary coach who changes the New Orleans. And maybe he can be. Maybe he hasn't gotten a chance to be a head coach before. Maybe that will unlock something, but I don't think we've really seen that level of revolution.
If he gets the time. Yeah. I think that's the hard part. There's just a lot of, roster turnover that's needed here. The cap situation is very real, finally. They can't just wiggle their way out of this one.
Yeah, and it's a team that's, more or less devoid of talent. I mean, to your point about the 80%, you know what I mean? Like, give me a good quarterback, and, you're probably going to be a pretty good coach. If you don't have the players, you don't. Like, I think Dan Quinn and Cliff Kingsbury did an unbelievable job this year. But, it also helps that Jaden Daniels is like a generational talent.
Yeah.
that's a different team with a,
both those guys were head coaches before, and it didn't necessarily look like that. All the time.
Right, exactly. I mean, so it's, it's really interesting. This will be interesting to see what Kellen Moore does. There are some people that are good coordinators that become great head coaches and vice versa. I don't think everyone is excited about Dan Campbell as a hire. He wasn't like a hot
he was
head
laughed
coach.
at. The kneecaps comment.
Right.
But at least Dan Campbell was like an outlier in terms of his profile coming in, where he was like high variance, where we didn't know what we were going to get out of Dan Campbell, and it feels like we've ridden the variance to a good degree with him. Doesn't seem like Kellen Moore has a great deal of variance, particularly with this roster, with all their questions basically everywhere. Like the defense really fell off as well. Like Derek Carr, had 2 good games to start. It's not a great situation anymore.
Yeah, and you just think about this. Like I think about Brian Callahan. Like jury's still out on Brian Callahan.
Right. Yeah.
And obviously comes from good stock, right? His father, a legendary coach. But it's one thing when you coach when you've got Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, and it's another thing when you're going there and you're trying to figure it out with a bad offensive line and not a lot of weapons. So there you go. And people, that's near us. They're applauding my take on Brian Callahan. This is awesome. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You have an audience.
Yeah, much happier with that take than he was your flashlight last night.
Apparently, yeah. Anyway, so we will see on Kellen Moore. I would suspect that it would be just given where, think about what they do in Philadelphia, think about what they did in Dallas for so many years, that this will be an offense that'll be once again revolved around Alvin Kamara and Chris Olave, right? Hopefully they get Rashid Shaheed back. They got to figure out quarterback. They don't know what they're doing here, but it's worth noting that he's had 6 years as an offense coordinator, Kellen Moore, and his offenses have been top 8 in scoring in 4 of those 6 years. So he's when he's been given talent, he's been able to produce. It's just this is a team devoid of talent.
Yeah, and to be fair to Kellen Moore, who we haven't really said that many good things about, like the Eagles, I don't think their offense is particularly complex, but perhaps that is the smartest thing to do with this offense, with their personnel, and he's done that, and they've been more successful than they were last year.
And listen, Brian Johnson was not successful with this offense last year. Now, he didn't have Saquon last year, but still, they had DeAndre Swift. They had real running backs,
top receivers.
It was more or less the same personnel with the exception of, an upgrade at running back. Big upgrade, but still, I don't know. You're right. Kellen Moore could be fine. It just doesn't feel like a super inspiring hire here for the Saints.
It's more in the Brian Schottenheimer bucket than, some of the other hires we've seen, like Ben Johnson.
Last thing I'll say here, though, Dan Quinn, not an inspiring hire. The fan base wanted Ben Johnson last year. And when Dan Quinn and Cliff Kingsbury were hired, it felt like, at least to some people, that this was like a second choice or, not the because last year it was Ben Johnson, it was Mike McDonald were the hot head coaching candidates, and Dan Quinn, it was sort of like come off the bad loss for Dallas had the bad loss in the playoffs where the Packers just blew them out at home, and so people were like, and obviously that worked out fantastically. So jury is still out. We will see who the Saints wind up with, but it's looking like it's going to be Kellen Moore, and it'll be an offense that'll be centered around the obvious guys.
Hey, it's Matthew Berry from NBCSports.com and RotorWorld.com, and I want to thank you so much for watching whatever it is you just watched, or if nothing else, being too lazy to click out of the autoplay after this video started, after whatever it is you actually wanted to watch finished. But now that you're here, I'd like to take a moment here to ask you respectfully now, okay? I'm asking you respectfully to subscribe to the NFL on NBC YouTube channel. You'll get the latest Roto-World fantasy news headlines, all sorts of great shows, including my own Fantasy Football Happy Hour. So go subscribe now. Again, I'm asking respectfully.